Howdy of you delicious people. This is the original coming to TO America. So, ultimately, I'm going to be reviewing coming number two America. So, ultimately, no one gets this confused with which movie is which, because I'm going to be doing both on the same day. Ultimately, some people might be enjoying the TO coming to America, so ultimately, I'm reviewing both on the same day. So I'm reviewing the original movie and the sequel on the same day, as well as any number of several other different projects, and then just calling it a day after I probably conk out of just going like, too much stuff. But anyways, so going into here, I thoroughly enjoy this movie. This movie probably won't end up on like the top 10 of movies or whatever, but when looking at it, I just thoroughly enjoy this movie. Like to the point of a awkward guy that is eventually seemingly going to get the girl that he likes, and eventually just everything is eventually going to work out. Like that's the thing that I like about this movie most, when you kind of boil it down to just that. That is the best part about this movie, is that the awkward guy wins the girl over in the end. That is the thing that I like about this movie the most. But then also you kind of get the jokery and the aspect of that Eddie Murphy needs to be any number of people in this one movie, and so does Arsenio Hall. To ultimately, when we get into the sequel, every single one of those characters that were originally in the first one of this movie, is going to be in the sequel, which I was really happy about. Because I'm like, man, like they're basically pulling out all the stops to just say like, yeah, Arsenio and Hall and everybody, they're going like they're really double dipping and being all of these characters at the same time. Probably that's why probably any number of either Arsenio or Eddie was probably exhausted after doing this movie, because it's like, God, we got to do all of this stuff all over again. Like I think that's probably why the movie is kind of cut the way it is because when looking at it, it's like that's why in the sequel there's kind of like a separation of story where you can tell like, oh, okay, well, I can understand now why they had to do things a certain way they did, because of what Eddie is really doing in this movie, uh, and so is Arsenio. So going into this, so we end up having it to where in this movie we ultimately have a restaurant called McDowell's, and ultimately I think that is actually the most funniest thing, because when really and honestly and truly looking at it, like I was wondering when there would ever be a parody of some restaurant. Like I was wondering when that was going to happen. Like ultimately, I was assessing or assuming that ultimately somebody was going to make a joke out of some fast food restaurant, and surefire enough, this was it. So we end up having it to where ultimately we have Cleo McDowell that ultimately is working at this McDowell restaurant, and we end up finding out that every single one of Cleo's uh, things that he does in in this restaurant is basically 100% a copy and paste of McDonald's, but it's just said differently. It's like uh, we ultimately have it to where like there's little subtle differences with every little thing that ultimately McDonald's uh, and McDowell's is doing, which I thought was interesting. So but ultimately, the whole entire thing isn't about McDowell's. I just thought it was the best thing about this movie. So we seemingly have it to where this is a love story, and ultimately, I just can really enjoy it for reasonably just how when uh, when Akeem is put into uh, being with the McDowells and just being uh, being in America, we ultimately have it to where reasonably you can just tell how awkward really Eddie is in this whole scenario. Where at home, like he's very much a different, like he's not as a awkward person because everybody is acting the exact same way. But then eventually, when Eddie goes into America, you can kind of see the slight differences between the ways of which that he talks compared to everyone else. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this in a very interest or in a like in a very like this movie is so iconic and it's so good. We really have it to where in this movie, like we have it to where like I was hoping maybe there'd be some kind of conclusions of some characters in the sequel and hush hush whether or not that they conclude things. Um, but anyways, so you can check this movie out on Amazon. You can also check out coming number two America in Amazon as well. Watch these for free if ultimately if you have an Amazon Prime account, or ultimately go into a Movie Pro and probably go and watch both these movies for absolutely free, or any other movie app that you can dare in fact go out of your way to say that you've seen this movie at some point. So let's go into the if I haven't done already, let's go into that number five time count to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So spoilers now. So ultimately we have it to where in the very beginning of this movie we ultimately kind of go into figuring out the life of a prince, of his like waking up day to day activity. So we end up having it to where Akeem is ultimately to wake up to uh, to basically have people follow him around wherever he goes, like plopping rose petals every single where of which he walks. And so we eventually have it to where Akeem ends up going and simple things like him going to the bathroom. Ultimately, there is a man there to brush his teeth for him, and to ultimately there's another man to come in and help him gargle his water and sorts. We ultimately have it to where Akeem is to be bathed by three different women, and we are to assess that ultimately Akeem basically sleeps with any number of these women while he's basically in the bath with them or anything along those lines. So we eventually have it to where Akeem is ultimately wanting like we have it to where we have this long slew of dining table where ultimately we have to have an intercom system to have people hear what they're saying to one another. And so Akeem ends up going like, you know what? Like I'm just kind of done. I'm just kind of tired of going through all of this. Because we end up having it uh, to where King Joffrey, or I think it's Joffrey. James Earl Jones's character ultimately is to tell Akeem what woman he is going to marry, and we end up having it to where Akeem ultimately talks to this woman, and he's ultimately asking her is like, well, hey, like, what do you like? Like, what is like, what are your interests? Like, what is your favorite movie? What's your favorite book? What's your favorite whatever? And every single response to this woman is whatever you like, and we end up having it to where Akeem ultimately gets frustrated, and he's like, well, so everything that you're going to do is to just please me, and I don't like that at all. So ultimately, we have to where Eddie messes with this girl and ultimately says, okay, well, like, bark like a dog and stand on one foot. And then ultimately, we have it to where Eddie asks her to um, uh, sound like a gorilla. And so ultimately, she does all this stuff. And we end up having it to where eventually uh, the king and Akeem are talking to one another, and so the girl ends up walking out of the room so they can have a private conversation. So we end up having it to where Akeem is ultimately like asking to when Akeem is at the table with his parents, he's ending up telling them it's like, well, you know what? How about I just do away with a lot of these servants? Like I'm so tired of having servants for everything, and so we end up having it to where the king ultimately, James Earl Jones, ultimately says like, okay, well, like you'll do away with the rose petal women. So from here on out, every time you walk, there won't be rose petals following you. So we end up having it to where ultimately we end up having it to where Akeem is to find out his wife, and so we end up having it to where Akeem and the king end up having a private conversation, and we end up having it to where Akeem says, "You know what? I need to get out of here. Like I need to go to America. I'm burnt out. Like I need to go uh, and then I'll come back." So we end up having the king mentioning it's like, well, oh, okay, well, like, how about you just go off for 40 days and 40 nights to America and sow your sow like sow your wild oats and just kind of just ultimately just get something out of your system, and then ultimately after those 40 days, you'll come back and marry this woman. So we end up having it to where Salim and Akeem are going off to America, and we end up having it to where Akeem is mentioning to Salim that's like, well, hey, the main reason why I'm going to America is I'm going to find my bride. Regardless of what my father says, I'm going to America to find my bride. So we end up having it to where ultimately Akeem and Salim end up going, and Akeem wants to live the worst, uh, like gutter roll of life possible in America. We end up having it to where, uh, like Salim and Akeem are wearing all these like gold medallions and all this stuff, and we end up having it to where this taxi driver calls him some inappropriate word. So we end up having it to where Akeem and Salim ultimately getting into this taxi and saying like, "Where's the worst part of town that ultimately we can find a room at?" And so ultimately we end up having it to where Akeem and Salim end up going to this apartment building. They get an apartment, and so ultimately like they're trying to find the worst possible place to live in, and they end up finding out that there's some room where like there's a blind man who ended up getting killed, and so they take this room. So we end up having it to where consistently like Akeem is wanting to live in utter squalor, to where ultimately like they have to look like real true Americans and they have to be roughing it, even though it seems that money is no object for them. So we end up having it to where reasonably that they end up deciding it's like, well, what would normal Americans do? And so they end up deciding to go and get a job. So, because what ends up happening is that uh, they end up going into this seemingly this town get together, where ultimately we have this reverend who is going and having this guy perform uh, that ultimately has the band Se Actual Chocolate, and so we end up having it to a reasonably uh, Randy Watson. There we go. I believe is the character's name. So we end up having it to where Randy Watson is performing, and so we end up having to where Lisa, who is Lisa McDowell of the McDowell restaurant, ultimately uh, they were giving food for charity, I guess. We end up having to where Lisa goes on there and asking for donations, and ultimately he's like, well, it'd be nice if we can get money that clings, but we would really actually like the money that folds. Like basically mentioning like, hey, like let's get like a big amount of donations. Let's get dollar amount donations. We end up having it to where Lisa's boyfriend is a man named Daryl Jenkins, who we seem to find out that uh, his family is rich uh, off of some Soul hairspray. And so ultimately there's a commercial and everything like that of like Jerry Curl and whatever what have you. And so ultimately we have it to where this guy has like of course like the time period hair, and I really appreciate that. So we end up having it to where Lisa ends up going uh, and going with Daryl at this point in juncture. And so we end up having it to her reasonably that they're passing out donations. And so we end up having it to where Akeem takes every little bit of money that they have and dumps it all into the donation box. And so we ultimately have it to where Akeem is looking at Lisa and he's like, that's the one. That's the girl I want. And so ultimately we end up having to where Akeem ends up finding out where this girl is and is ultimately at McDowell's. And so we end up having to where Salim and Akeem end up going and getting a job at McDowell's so that way they can so that way Akeem can get closer to Lisa. So we end up having it to where we find out uh, that ultimately Cleo McDowell, we find out that he had lost his wife, and that ultimately we find out that ultimately all the differences between his McDowell's and McDonald's. And ultimately, we have it to where consistently, like, Cleo is consistently paranoid about, like, hey, are you the guys from McDonald's? Because ultimately he's just waiting for any moment that he's gonna get sued by McDonald's somehow. So we end up having it to where ultimately, because ultimately we have like the Big Mac from McDonald's. Ultimately, the Big Mac at McDowell's is called the Big Mike. It's the exact same sandwich. The lettuce, pickles on a sesame seed bun or whatever. And so everything about the Big Mac there is the exact same thing. It's just the fact that ultimately they name it different, or there's a slight variation. Like in the sequel, they ultimately go into a little bit of that in the sequel, but like it's not as prominent as here. And so we end up having it to where I think the Big Mac there is a Big Mike, I think, or something like that. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so Cleo is ultimately explaining all of this stuff that eventually, if these kids work, or if Akeem and Salim ultimately work hard enough, that ultimately in like 20 years they'll make something of themselves in someday. So we ultimately have it to where Akeem and Salim are ultimately doing, I guess, what would be like deemed to be like peasant work or whatever. We ultimately have it to where Salim is ultimately kind of really upset about having to work at McDowell's because he's like, dude, I don't want to do manual labor. Like, no, like I don't want to do any of this. And we end up having to where like Salim is complaining that ultimately he desperately needs a manicure, and like Akeem is calling them out on like, seriously, like God, like this stuff that they're doing right now is building character, and and Salim is really whining and crying about it. How like basically he like Salim isn't really wired for this lifestyle, and we end up having it to where like Akeem is just relishing in all this. He's having like so much fun doing all of this. So we end up having it uh to where Akeem is really trying to win the McDowells over. So ultimately, we have it to where Akeem ends up going and talking to Cleo about the football game between the New York Giants and the Green Bay Packers. Ultimately, talking about that the game had been won by a field goal, and we end up having it to where like Akeem is ultimately explaining it in such a way that doesn't make sense, and Cleo is ultimately saying, "You know what? McDowell is ultimately is telling him like, I'm only going to tell you this once. It's like, cut out the drugs, kid." So, because we end up having it to where like to where Akeem knows nothing about American sports because ultimately he had played soccer in God, what was it? Where are they from? Oh my God, I had completely freaking spaced out about where they have been from. Oh my God, and I had said that on the other review. So God, so much information going on right now. Eventually it'll pop in there, I hope, but maybe it won't. So, Zamunda. Oh, there we go. Zamunda. There we go. Good God. So, and interesting enough, they ended up deciding between LA and New York. And so, they end up having a coin flip to otherwise decide where they were going to come to America, and so they otherwise decided to go to New York. So because heads prevailed, so we end up having it to ultimately. So Akeem is trying to win McDowell over, and nothing's quite working. We end up having it to where Lisa ends up talking to Daryl and mentioning it's like, hey, there was a really sizable donation that ultimately was at this like get together. It's like, hey, Daryl, was that you? And Daryl's like, you know what? I love the kids. I love giving to charity. I just can't help it. And so ultimately, Lisa's like, oh, that must have been him. Oh, what a nice gesture. And so we end up having it to where Daryl is a douchebag and he lies because that's his character. Sorry. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so we end up having it to where Akeem is to eventually talk to Lisa and like talk about about trash and stuff like that. Because ultimately we have it to where either Akeem is either like mopping things or he's ultimately like trying to get trash from people. So you ultimately have it to where Akeem is talking to Lisa, and it seems that like they're trying to find common ground. Eventually, we get to the point to where ultimately uh, Lisa is to talk with her uh, sister Patrice, and she is going to set her up with Akeem. And so Lisa is going to go with Daryl, and Patrice is ultimately going to go with Akeem to ultimately go on this double date to go to I think it's it's a basketball um it's a basketball game. So we end up having it to where ultimately that Patrice is ultimately seeing Akeem and she's like, mm-hmm. So we end up having it to where this entire time this basketball game is going on, and so we end up having it to where Daryl is ultimately talking to uh, Daryl is talking to Akeem and kind of making fun of every little bit of the place uh, where Akeem is from, Samunda, and so as I have to prove that I now know what that freaking thing is. So we end up having to where ultimately Daryl is asking Akeem what kind of sports that ultimately is where he's from, and we'll ultimately have it to where um, Akeem says it's like, well, we play football. I believe what you would actually call it here would be soccer, because we end up finding out that Patrice is ultimately dipping her hand and seemingly uh, touching Akeem right where his pants are. Let's just say she's really digging deep, touching those pants. Let's just say so. We end up having it to where Akeem ultimately is seeing that the quarter is ended, and ultimately he gets up and is like, "Yeah!" And so we end up having it to where ultimately Akeem is to go to the bathroom, and there is a vendor that ends up noticing that Prince Akeem, is ultimately at the bathroom, and so we end up having to where Akeem ends up walking away to get away from this guy from ultimately getting recognized. So we end up having it to where Keem ends up walking away, and so Lisa and Daryl end up bumping back into him. And this vendor is desperately asking, like, "Oh my God, can I get a photo with you?" And so we end up having them do this photo, and Lisa's like, "What is going on here?" And so Akeem ends up mentioning, it's like, well, like he's just a guy that I met in the bathroom. And so ultimately, like, these guys are so proud to have met this guy and all kinds of things. And so ultimately, like, Lisa and Daryl are just severely weirded out by this. So we end up having it to where eventually, so we end up having it to where McDowell is so won over by Akeem and Salim that we end up having it to where he's like, "Hey guys, like, you know what? Like, you guys are really winning me over. How about you go over to my house and we'll have a get together?" So this get together ends up having it to where Akeem and Salim are still ending up doing manual labor for McDowell's. And so we end up having it to where Salim is going to end up having to forcibly park cars. And we end up having it to where Akeem is ultimately going to be the guy that is to open up bottles for people. And so funny enough, we end up having it to where McDowell's is ultimately mentioning to Akeem, like, man, just look at the life that you can possibly have if ultimately you'd work if you'd work hard enough. Like, ultimately, in 20 years, like, maybe you'll have a house like this one day. And we end up having it to where, like, Akeem is ultimately just like, yeah, wouldn't that be lovely? It's like, really just like Akeem is living so much more of a higher life than Cleo could ever imagine. And but we have it to where like Akeem is having such a twist and turn of every little bit of this that it's coming off as funny to have it to where like uh like Akeem had lived in a place where there's like probably 100 different rooms in one house, and we end up having into where Cleo and McDowell is just kind of mentioning about how like lavish his life is and how like yeah, if you want to work really hard, eventually all of this will be yours someday. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, this party is all getting together. We seemingly have Daryl at this party, Lisa is at this party, and so we end up having it to where ultimately that McDowell is going around like really this entire movie is all really glued to Cleo McDowell. Like, man, like there's a lot of work that this guy has to do compared to everybody else in this movie. Like, I would say that this guy is kind of like the glue to this movie. Realistically, he's kind of like he's the comedic act, but he's also just kind of like really like tying into this movie really well. So we end up having it to where Cleo is kind of like, "Hey, you're here. Hey, Eddie. Hey, you're here. Oh, man." So we end up having it to where ultimately Daryl is ultimately because what ends up winning these guys over to get to this party is eventually we find out that McDowell's is getting robbed by Samuel Jackson. And so we end up having it to where Akeem ultimately goes uh, and stops this assailant from uh, taking this guy down by basically a mop, by a simple stick, ultimately going and getting this guy to drop his gun and his guard, to where Arsenio ends up picking it up and ultimately just uh, ends up stopping this guy from robbing this place. So that's what ends up winning over McDowell with Akeem and Salim to do this party for them and pop these bottles. And ultimately, because there's a reason why I'm mentioning all this. So getting to this party, so we end up having it to where Daryl ends up going to Akeem and mentioning it's like, hey man, I probably would have stopped that goon too, but you know what? Like I had a coffee in my hands. You understand, right? And where Akeem is just like, oh my god, I just, but I'm gonna be nice to this guy because I'm nice to everybody. So we end up having it to where ultimately, like, I think Daryl is quasi starting to see Akeem as like, you know what, this guy is really gonna like I think eventually he's gonna really win Lisa over. So maybe I should just like kind of like mark my territory kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Daryl ends up talking to Akeem, and we get into the conversation of basically Daryl mentioning that it's like, well, hey, uh, like I heard you talking to Lisa, and so ultimately we have it to where Daryl gets into the conversation of like he ultimately wants to kind of put Lisa in her place and stuff along those lines. Because earlier we had in the movie where Daryl was talking to Lisa and saying like, "Hey, how about you quit all this? Like, how about you just kind of like quit being a McDowell's?" Like, I think because reasonably, like, we have it to where like Daryl is kind of an old fashioned man, where ultimately he probably wanted Lisa to um, be living at home and with him, I guess. I don't know. Kind of an old fashioned way of doing things, I guess. But Lisa loves to work, and ultimately, Lisa just loves being a McDowell. So ultimately, that's what she just does. So we end up having it to where Daryl is talking to Akeem about like having kind of Lisa being put in her place. And so ultimately, we have it to where Daryl goes and pulls away McDowell to ultimately uh, tell McDowell it's like, hey, like, um, it seems like this party is going to be an engagement party. So we end up having McDowell and Daryl ending up going and having a speech mentioning that like, hey, like, I guess ultimately we have it to where Daryl had proposed to Lisa, which was never actually the truth. Like, so ultimately we have it to where Lisa is storming out because she's frustrated that everyone is planning her life for her and arranging things without her say so. And so ultimately we have it to where Lisa ends up storming out, Daryl ends up going after her, and so it ends up that basically Daryl and Lisa are broken up because basically Daryl is taking too much control of this relationship and Lisa doesn't like it. So she ends up just calling it off. So we end up having to where Akeem, seemingly after this party, is going and trying to comfort Lisa. And so we end up having it to where like Lisa and Akeem are just having kind of common talk. But I think it's also kind of funny when Akeem is to go and sit on the swing, he's just all like buffed out and whatever. And Lisa's like, "Can't you just sit normally? Can't you just relax?" And he's like, "I can relax." And so to me, he just kind of like hunches over. And so we end up having it to where like they talk to one another and kind of talk about this whole situation, and really like Lisa for the early parts of this movie would have this kind of just very weird wooden delivery for all of her lines, which ultimately she'd be like, yeah, like isn't that great, Akeem? Uh-huh. Like that would be a lot of her deliveries when like it kind of feels obvious like that she didn't really have much to say there, or like it seems like some of her performances feel like very wooden at some points, but then there's also really good times where she gives really good deliveries and stuff like that. So we end up having it to where Lisa is going and telling her side of that story where she's like, yeah, it seems like everybody is arranging things for me and I don't like it. And we end up having it to where Akeem can sympathize with that and say, well, yeah, like in my country, everybody is getting arranged marriages, and like ultimately, like I don't like it either. So we end up having it to where Lisa is basically crying on Akeem's shoulder, and Akeem is okay with it. To where ultimately Lisa is like, you know what, like you're a really nice guy, like like hey, thank you for like listening to all my crap, and just ultimately you can kind of like you're on the same kind of wavelength of me, and you can kind of understand things, and like Akeem, like Lisa having dialogue with Daryl and Lisa having dialogue with Akeem is like day and night. It's really just like the dialogue between them two is vastly different. And we end up having it to where Lisa is ultimately telling Akeem, it's like, you know what, I can probably actually tell you just about anything. And we ultimately have it to where Akeem is like, well, that would be great. Like, hey, you could tell me anything. So we end up having it to where Lisa is won over by Akeem, and so we end up having it to where like the very next day that it seems that Lisa and Akeem are at McDowell's again, and we end up having it to where ultimately they are going to quite possibly put a date together. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Akeem is to mention it's like, well, hey, how about I cook you food? How about you come to my place and I'll cook you food? So we end up having it to where Akeem goes to his apartment and ultimately finds out that Salim had bought like tons upon tons of things to ultimately be living the high life, because we end up having Akeem telling Salim that he needs to clean up the apartment, and he cleans it up, but it's a little bit too well to where they're living the high life. And so ultimately we have it to where Akeem ultimately takes all the money that Salim has and gives it off to some homeless person. And so we end up having it to where eventually Salim goes off to deliver a note or deliver a letter to the king to ultimately say, hey, we need like $1 million because we're in dire straits, which is a lie, which ultimately forces the king to ultimately go all the way to America to see what the heck is going on with his son. So we end up having it to where ultimately Lisa is to ultimately try to go and get a meal in Akeem's apartment, but Akeem eventually says no. There's a rat in here. There's no way we can go and eat a meal in here. So ultimately, Lisa says, "Well, hey, how about we go and eat out?" So they end up eating out. It seems like this date is going really, really well. Excuse me for a second. Ugh. Hoo! Hooty hoo. So we end up having it to where reasonably during this date that Akeem is really trying to have him be very mysterious. Mentioned that he's like a goat herder or any number of things that ultimately seems like a lie, but it's just kind of bending the truth a lot. Um, we end up having it to where Lisa is to talk about where, like, because we end up having to where Lisa's talking a lot about her relationship with Daryl and how it wasn't working out, and at McDowell's, which ultimately causes this date. And then so eventually we have it to where Lisa is trying to get to know Akeem, but Akeem is kind of skirting around a lot of stuff, and ultimately uh, trying to avoid kind of really truly answering some questions here and there. So so we end up having it to where ultimately, so the king is to ultimately fly his way to America. And so ultimately we have it to where James Earl Jones ultimately goes on to trying to find his son. So we end up having it to where ultimately that the king goes into several locations to try and find his son. So we eventually have it to where ultimately the king ends up going to Semi and ultimately saying like, "Hey, like I thought you guys were living in dire straits. You had sent me a note saying that ultimately things were going horribly awry." We also eventually have it to where Patrice ultimately comes to Salim's apartment and finds out that it's like, "Hey, you guys are living the high life. How can you afford all these things?" And Salim ends up telling Patrice, "It's like, hey, yeah, I'm a king, uh, and Akeem is actually my servant," which actually is a lie. So told me win this girl over. So, but we eventually have it to where the king is talking to Salim. Or no, wait, no. Uh, the king is ultimately talking to the guy that is now in Salim and Akeem's apartment, which is their landlord, and that gets them to have him go to uh, McDowell's, and that gets him to go to McDowell's home eventually later on. Because what ends up happening is, so the king ends up going to McDowell's and is trying to find his son, and McDowell comes to greet them thinking that it's the McDonald's people, but it's not, it's the king. And so we end up having it to ultimately they find out that his son is doing manual labor, and the king's like, "My son works? My son, are you kidding me? My son is the Prince of Samunda, and why is he working?" So we end up having it to a reasonably that, like, Arsenio Hall's character is getting into some real hot water. Because eventually, we have the king eventually finding the note and really getting Salim into hot water because ultimately he's like, "Dude, like, you lied about I don't know how many numerous stuff." So we end up having it to ultimately. So the king is ultimately saying that he's going to be at some hotel, and to ultimately have McDowell call him when his son arrives. So we end up having it to where ultimately Akeem and Lisa are to be done with this date, and so Akeem is to be singing and dancing, um, basically away off of his date, and so eventually we have it to where Lisa and Akeem are to go to the McDowell home, and we eventually have it to where McDowell is trying to stall Akeem from leaving the house so that way he can call the king and have him come there to um, intercept them. So that's when ultimately we have it to where eventually Akeem is to find out that the king is there, because ultimately he sees rose petals at his apartment, and so we have it to where Akeem is scrambling, because ultimately he is singing and dancing like to be loved, and so We ultimately have it to where Akeem is happy to go to his apartment, but then he realizes the rose petals, and so he ends up going uh, and seeking out Lisa to basically tell her it's like, hey, I don't have much long here because ultimately, like, there's some stuff that I have to tell you, uh, but not right now. So we have it to where McDowell is stalling, and so ultimately, by the time that uh, by the time Akeem leaves, the king eventually comes in and ultimately is to talk to McDowell and then eventually talk to Lisa. Ultimately, the king ultimately mentions that basically this girl is not good enough for his prince. We ultimately had it to where the king ends up giving Samunda money to McDowell, and so ultimately we end up finding out that Prince Akeem was ultimately on this money, and so ultimately we have it to where uh, when Akeem leaves, McDowell breaks the secret to Lisa that this guy is made of money, that he basically is on actual money, and so ultimately it's just the fact of like, oh, okay, well, like this guy's legit. This guy's rich. Because ultimately, the entire time we had McDowell kind of forcing Daryl on Lisa because Daryl was rich. And so, reasonably, that was really a relationship that Lisa didn't want. It was just a relationship that McDowell wanted. So, we end up having it to ultimately that Lisa is to find out that 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 Akeem is a prince. And so now we have it to her forcibly that the king uh, is making his way to this home to ultimately say that Lisa isn't good enough for him. And so eventually we have it to where Akeem and Salim make their way to the McDowell house to confront for Akeem to confront his father. We ultimately have it to where Akeem is mentioning, "Hey, like, where's Lisa?" And we end up finding out that Lisa ended up having to leave just because of how distraught she was. And Akeem ends up making his way there and ends up confronting his father and ends up saying the real reason why he came here was to get a bride and was not actually to like submit to uh, what the king wanted. So we end up having it to where Akeem ends up chasing after Lisa because we end up having it to where Akeem's mother is ultimately like noticing that he really is in love with this girl, and so uh, Akeem's mother is ultimately saying like, "You do really like this girl, don't you?" And he's like, "Yes, of course I do." So it's like we end up having it to where Akeem's mother is ultimately saying like, "Go after her then," to where ultimately kind of negating her anything that his father had said. So we end up having it to where Akeem is chasing Lisa to this subway station to ultimately have it to where he's chasing her off and she's like, we're two different people and there's no way this is ever going to work. And we end up having it to where Lisa is ultimately throwing into Akeem's face that basically he lied to her. And it's like, well, like, one, you wouldn't have believed me if I was a prince. But on top of that, it's like I didn't think me like being a king really or being a prince really mattered to you. Like I thought that ultimately it was just like I wanted you to love me for me, not for my title or my kingdom or my whatever. So we end up having it to where like Lisa's saying like they're too different, things won't work, and so ultimately we have it to where Lisa is just like, there's no way that I'm going to be able to marry a prince. And so ultimately we have it uh, to where Akeem is like, well, I'm going to renounce my throne then. Like, I will say right now that I renounce my throne. Like, is that good enough for you? Like I'll throw this all away, for you. And so ultimately, all the people, all the subway people are all looking at him, and they're like, like go for it, girl. Like he's basically throwing it all away for you, so go for it. And she's like, no, this just won't work, and she ends up walking off. So we end up having just Akeem just heartbroken, and so like we have it to where Akeem just goes and is like, sure, Dad, whatever you want. Like, I'll do whatever you want. Just let's go to Samunda. Let's get married with this girl. And blah, blah, blah. I'll just go through the motions and I'll just hate the rest of my life. But it'll be whatever it is. So we end up having a tour. Akeem ends up going and uh, getting married. And instead of it being the girl that ultimately he was going to be. Consistently for the rest of his life being barked at from this girl. Instead, we end up having it to where Akeem ends up tossing back the veil, and it is Lisa. And so ultimately, we have it to where the king is ultimately like, "Ha, like, swerved ya." So we end up having it to where Akeem is ultimately just like, "Yeah, like this is the girl that I wanted." And so ultimately, we have McDowell kind of walking, and he's like, "Ha ha ha!" Like, so we end up having it to where both of them get married, and so they end up kind of making their way out of this wedding. And so ultimately, Lisa's like, "You would have seriously given all of this up for me?" And Akeem was like, "Yep, you bet it, you betcha." So that is really just how this movie eventually just ends with a happy ending, and like it's a really good movie. I really enjoy it. At the end of the day, there might have been some scenes here that kind of mixed around or whatever, but when looking at it, really good movie. Like I just like the fact that it's like one of those like it's a really good love story, and it's ultimately just one of those where you get the awkward guy that gets the girl in the end, and I think that's the biggest good thing about this movie. So considering how long this video is, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.